I think these days, especially in the States, you have to be a politician or an assassin or something to really be a superstar.
Jim Morrison is one of rock and roll's most legendary frontmen, a man whose wild antics, poetic musings, and untamed stage presence made the Doors one of the most controversial and incredible bands of the late 60s. To fans, Morrison was a visionary, a lizard king who blurred the lines between rock star, poet, and provocateur. But among his fellow musicians, he wasn't always so revered. Quite a few of rock's biggest names had serious issues with him. Lou Reed.
Are you happier as a brunette?
Are you happier as a schmuck?
I'm no schmuck.
I'm no brunette.
You were blonde last time, though.
No, I wasn't.
Few artists embodied the intellectual avant-garde spirit of New York's underground rock scene like Lou Reed. As the frontman of the Velvet Underground, Reed was a champion of gritty realism, poetic lyricism, and artistic experimentation. Jim Morrison, on the other hand, represented everything Reed found ridiculous about the West Coast hippie movement. The Doors' psychedelic theatrics, Morrison's drug-fueled mysticism, and the band's larger-than-life marketing all stood in direct opposition to Reed's stripped-down cerebral style. The two were emblematic of the ongoing cultural clash between New York's dark, cynical art scene and LA's sunshine-fueled counterculture. Reed had no patience for Morrison's self-proclaimed poetic brilliance or his messianic onstage persona. He viewed the Lizard King's blend of rock and performance art as shallow, even idiotic. In his eyes, the Velvet Underground was a band for, quote, really, really smart people, while the California scene, Morrison included, was really, really stupid. He dismissed the Doors as overhyped and regarded Morrison as an overrated frontman. The animosity between them only deepened when Andy Warhol's Circle accused Morrison of copying their aesthetic. According to Warhol, dancer Gerard Malanga was outraged to see Morrison mimicking his leather-clad, brooding persona. To Reed, this was yet another example of the Doors taking New York's underground edge and selling it to the masses. Even in death, Reed had little sympathy for Morrison. When he heard the news Morrison had died in a Paris bathtub, his response was biting and cruel. Quote, "How fabulous in a bathtub in Paris." Jimi Hendrix. If Lou Reed viewed Jim Morrison as an intellectual lightweight, Jimi Hendrix saw him as an obnoxious nuisance. Though both were icons of 1960s rock, they had wildly different personalities and approaches to music. Hendrix was known for his quiet, humble nature and deep love for experimentation. Morrison, on the other hand, thrived on chaos. Their paths crossed in 1968 during a legendary jam session at The Scene, a popular club in New York. Morrison, heavily intoxicated, stumbled onto the stage while Hendrix played, slurring and growling into the microphone. His attempt at singing was so disastrous that Hendrix stopped playing and sarcastically announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the sound of Jim Morrison." But the situation only got worse. Morrison, now completely out of control, allegedly started groping Hendrix mid-performance. Watching from the audience, Janis Joplin, who had already been irritated by Morrison's antics, had enough. She smashed a bottle over his head in what many saw as a justified act of self-defense. After that night, Hendrix wanted nothing to do with Morrison. Though Morrison admired Hendrix's work, the feeling was far from mutual. Frank Zappa. For someone as eccentric and unconventional as Frank Zappa, it might seem surprising that he had such a strong dislike for Jim Morrison. But Zappa's brand of weirdness was rooted in disciplined musicianship, sharp social commentary, and a deep disdain for the drug culture that consumed the 60s. Unlike most of his rock and roll peers, Zappa never indulged in drugs, believing they transformed people into unreliable, delusional versions of themselves. And for him, Morrison was the prime example of everything wrong with the drug-fueled rockstar archetype. Morrison's self-destruction, his lack of discipline, and his messianic rock god persona were all traits that Zappa found repulsive. While the Doors marketed themselves as poetic visionaries exploring the fringes of human consciousness, Zappa saw them as a commercialized, overhyped act. He found the band's image distasteful and exaggerated, stating their branding, quote, stretched beyond the realm of credibility. To him, Morrison was nothing more than a pretentious frontman with a drinking problem. Jerry Garcia.
Once you have your act down, once you have it together, keep on doing it. That's what the people want. You know, they're coming back to see Judy Garland for the umpty billionth time, and you know, whatever. You know, they're there to see you do your little dance, and I feel that that's a serious limit on anybody who, you know, feels that they're an artist, you know, rather than an entertainer.
If Jim Morrison had one quality that seemed to alienate his peers, it was his tendency to borrow, whether it was ideas, aesthetics, or stage presence. For Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, this was the root of his dislike for the Doors frontman. Garcia believed Morrison had no real originality, dismissing him as a poor imitation of Mick Jagger. He took issue with Morrison's performance style, claiming that his entire onstage persona, from his mannerisms to his movements, was lifted straight from Jagger's playbook. Garcia didn't stop at criticizing Morrison's stage presence. He found the Doors to be completely unoriginal, a haphazard blend of influences that added up to nothing special. While the Grateful Dead prided themselves on their improvisational, deeply personal approach to music, Garcia believed the Doors were just repackaging the work of other artists. And when Morrison tried to pivot away from his rock god persona and lean into poetry, Garcia dismissed it as another attempt to elevate himself above his actual talent level. Dennis Wilson.
He told me, like, you know, you'd be at a party, like, and it'd be the most beautiful chicks and the best drugs, and everyone's, like, feeling it. And then Jim Morrison would show up, shove someone down the stairs, and then go lay in the street until the cops come. He goes, that's bullshit.
At one point, Jim Morrison and Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys had a strong friendship, but it was one that quickly soured. Their bond took a dark turn when Charles Manson entered the picture. Both Morrison and Wilson had crossed paths with Manson before his infamous murder spree, and Wilson in particular was deeply shaken by the experience. According to Ray Manzarek, Morrison once picked up Manson while hitchhiking, completely unaware of the cult leader's true nature. Manson, at the time, was trying to launch a music career, and Wilson, who had also encountered him, had briefly entertained the idea of helping him. But when Manson's sinister side emerged, Wilson was horrified. He distanced himself from Manson, but the paranoia and fear that followed had a lasting impact on his mental state. As the years went on, both Morrison and Wilson fell deeper into addiction, and their friendship crumbled. Wilson, known for his own destructive tendencies, witnessed Morrison's drunken, belligerent behavior firsthand. One night at the Whiskey A Go-Go, Morrison was heckling bands, and Wilson, fed up, attacked him. David Crosby. David Crosby never made any secret of his feelings towards Jim Morrison. In a 1998 interview, when asked if he knew the Doors frontman, he responded bluntly, "I knew him, I didn't like him." Morrison's drinking and reckless behavior left a bad impression on Crosby, who saw him as nothing more than an obnoxious guy. Though Crosby acknowledged Morrison's talent as a poet, he believed his reputation was overinflated and his antics overshadowed whatever artistic merit he had. John Densmore.
I'd never take acid with that guy. He's crazy. And I never did, believe me.
Of all the people who had a complicated relationship with Jim Morrison, perhaps no one felt it as deeply as John Densmore, the Doors drummer. Densmore both admired and feared Morrison. While he respected Morrison's artistry, he struggled with his volatile behavior. In interviews, he's been described living in terror of Morrison's unpredictability, calling him a psychopath and a lunatic. Even after Morrison's death, Densmore found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. He spent years protecting Morrison's legacy, even fighting in court to preserve the Doors' artistic integrity. Yet he's also been honest about the damage Morrison caused. In hindsight, Densmore admitted he wished he'd called Morrison out on his abusive behavior. Why so many rock stars hated Jim Morrison? Jim's legacy is powerful, but among his fellow musicians, he left behind a trail of resentment, frustration, and outright hostility. One of the biggest issues was his drug and alcohol-fueled antics. While rock and roll has always had its share of excess, Morrison took it to an extreme, even his most hard-living peers found exhausting. Then there was his perceived lack of originality. Artists like Garcia and Lou Reed dismissed Morrison as someone who borrowed too much from others. But perhaps the most common complaint was his arrogance. Morrison carried himself like he was a rock and roll prophet. While his fans bought into that mythology, many of his peers weren't convinced. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your thoughts on Jim Morrison? Let us know in the comments section below.